screwed over like some other states. So fracking, what is it? Fracking is a well stimulation technique, and we got a nice little diagram over here. You drill a well either horizontally, and the new technology is to be able to drill, vertically, and then the new technology is to be able to drill horizontally, and that allows you to, drill through an oil or gas shale, which is a geologic formation that has hydrocarbons trapped in it. And we've already gotten a lot of the easy oil and gas out of the ground around the country, just drill in and that stuff pops right back out. So we're having to develop new technologies to stimulate these formations. And what fracking is the injection of usually high volumes of water, often mixed with chemicals, and sometimes often sand as well. And they pump it in at really high pressures in order to fracture the formation. The sand goes into these fractures to hold the fractures open, and then the oil or gas can rush into the well, and they pump it right back out. So that's your two-sentence version of what fracking is. So we're going to talk a little bit about the dangers of hydraulic fracturing because, industry can tell you what's so great about it. We're getting all this oil and gas out of the ground, and energy independence, blah blah blah, all that good stuff. However, it comes with huge costs, and a lot of those claims that they're making aren't even true. So we're going to put this in the context of what's wrong with this practice, and then we're talking about what we're going to do about it. So just a little example, this map here is from Earth Justice, which is an organization that, awesome environmental group that sues a lot of people. And this is a map of fraccidents, or accidents from fracking. And the point is that pretty much everywhere that there's fracking happening, things are going wrong, whether it's spills or health issues, water contamination, air problems, problems with people's property value, etc. So we're going to run through some of these big topics and talk about how it relates to fracking, especially here in California. And I'd like to break it into a few big groups: climate, air quality, water quality and quantity, seismic implications, community impacts, and then a few economic concerns. So we'll talk first about climate. So oil and gas drilling is one of the biggest polluters of methane in the country. According to EPA, the oil and gas industry is accountable for 40% of methane emissions in the United States. And methane is a greenhouse gas that is about 20 to 40 times more potent than CO2 in the short term. So when you're drilling for oil or gas and releasing methane, you've got huge climate implications. And one of the problems is that all the equipment, and hearing about pipelines, we know that they leak and break. And there's been estimates of leakage rates on natural gas drilling for between 3 up to 10, 12% of the methane that's being transported actually just leaks straight into the atmosphere. So huge impacts on climate, and what the picture here is of a methane flare, and they often burn this methane off, which does reduce some of its climate impacts, but still releases massive amounts of carbon into the air, and contributes greatly to global warming. So when we're talking about fracking, whether it's on the East Coast for natural gas, a lot of the climate benefits of natural gas that were being touted a few years ago, the more we learn about this, the more we realize that we don't actually get any climate benefits from drilling for natural gas because of this methane issue. Here in California, we're mostly fracking for oil. So what do we know about oil? We know that when you burn it, you release carbon dioxide. And so even if we're getting all this energy out of the ground, and it's this new technology that's so great, we're still burning a huge amount of oil. And the Monterey Shale is the largest unconventional oil formation in the country. It's in California, and it contains about 15 billion barrels of oil. If we were to burn all that oil, we would be releasing 6.5 metric tons of carbon into the atmosphere. Just to put that in perspective, the life of the Keystone XL pipeline is projected to, the oil that's transported in that is projected to emit about 7 billion metric tons. So we're on kind of the same order of magnitude of climate impact to these two, different things. Air quality. So air quality is a huge issue, and there's been a lot of focus around fracking is on what happens to the water, because you're drilling through and through aquifers, you're injecting chemicals. However, some of the most concrete problems with fracking are the air quality issues. So when you're drilling in, deep into the ground, you're releasing a whole bunch of nasty stuff. Volatile organic compounds, which produce smog and have, direct health correlations on asthma, respiratory illnesses, sickness, nausea, bloody noses. There's been a number of reported incidences of these things for folks living around drilling sites. There was a study out of the Denver School of Public Health, basically said if you live within half a mile of a drilling site, you're much more likely to get cancer. So there's direct health correlation, and most of them have to do with the air quality issues around fracking and oil and gas drilling in general. It's well documented, and the trends are, obvious that they're there. Another thing is with methane also contributes to smog-forming pollution. And this is a picture of LA, and we know that there's a whole bunch of oil in the Los Angeles area, so when we're drilling and fracking for oil in areas that are already compromised on air quality, we're only going to make it worse. Water quality. So there's a number of ways that water and fracking tie in together. The first way, and the most common way that water becomes contaminated from fracking operations is from the wastewater of fracking. Here in California, if you drill a well for oil, about 80% of what you pull out of the ground is actually water. And it's not just nice water that you could drink or dump in a river or whatever. It's really nasty stuff. It's high in salinity, so if you were to spill it on cropland, you'd be ruining it. High in heavy metals like boron, selenium, arsenic, lead, sometimes mercury, and often high in radioactive levels, naturally occurring radioactive material. So we're producing a huge amount of wastewater, and it's on the order of around 1.2 billion barrels of this stuff a year gets produced in California, which is a huge amount, and we've got to deal with that somehow. And there's not really a good way to deal with it. What they usually do is inject it back down into the earth to stimulate more oil and gas production. And the problem is you're moving billions of gallons of water up and down through wells, and you've got all these pathways for contamination. So if you look right here, you can see like you're going right through an aquifer. If you happen to have any type of well casing failure, you're going to potentially contaminate that aquifer. You've got the potential for the fractures that you're creating to go in unintended places, and there's actually the potential for migration of oil, gas, and chemicals to migrate through geologic formations. What you're going to hear industry say is, oh, the fracking is happening so far underneath the water table that there's really no threat. However, they've never really looked at this long term, and there is more and more evidence to show that when you put something into the ground, it doesn't just stay there in the same place. And here in California, we have tons of faults. Some of them we know about, some of them we don't, and we know that those are pathways for things to move along. We've also got problems with disposing of the wastewater. Some common practices are dumping wastewater into ponds and holding them that way. If you're filling your ponds with water that's laced with tons of chemicals, they can off-gas, create health problems. They can leach into groundwater. There's an example of an almond farmer in Kern County in the Central Valley who had his whole almond farm contaminated from improper storage of oil and gas wastewater right near his property and then pushed into the groundwater. So the wastewater issue is one of the most common ways that surface and groundwater can become contaminated associated with fracking. We've also got problems with the actual fracking process. And we mentioned before that they use a lot of chemicals in this. The U.S. House of Representatives did a study in 2011 and identified about 750 different chemicals which are commonly used in the fracking process. And at least 30 of them are known or believed to cause human health problems or are considered hazardous under the Clean Air and Clean Water Acts. And when you're pumping those into the ground, a lot of things can go wrong. And whether it's through well casing failure, a spill on site from faulty equipment, or a truck accident, if you're transporting thousands of gallons of chemicals and something happens to your truck that's holding that, that's going to spill on the side of the road and contaminate waterways. So we've got a whole bunch of issues with just transporting large volumes of hazardous water. And anytime you do that on a large scale, you're going to have risks. Water quantity is a big concern. Here in California, we've been fighting over water for the last 100 years. Do you guys know about the proposed peripheral tunnel project? Anyone? Quick show of hands who knows about this? So we've got a lot more water up in the north and the Sacramento Delta, and we have to get water down to farmers in the Central Valley and in the Los Angeles and Southern California part of the state. So the plan right now is to spend about $16 billion and build these massive tunnels to transport a huge volume of water down into the southern part of the state. And fracking can use, it's a range of how much water is used on fracking. On the East Coast, we've heard reports of like between 1 and 5 million gallons of water per well, and it's usually fresh water. Here in California, it's traditionally been slightly lower volumes of water, but we're expecting to see a spike in that as the technology improves out here. And really what I'm getting at here is the problem is we're investing a ton of money to move water around for farmers in California. We're the largest farming state. Yet it's dropping off, these tunnels are going to pop out right in the middle of Kern County by Bakersfield, which is the heart of oil country and fracking country. And we've seen in other states the oil industry bidding up the price of water and outbidding farmers, and farmers getting crunched on the amount of water they can get and the prices that they can afford. Now these oil companies, of course, are the wealthiest companies in the world, so they can outbid a lot of farmers and get the water. So that's just to put it in the context of we're spending all this money and doing these huge projects to move water around here in California, yet it may just be so the oil and gas industry has more access to it, and that is a major concern. One other note on this is after you use all this water, and if you inject it deep into an underground injection well, like a lot of the wastewater is done with here in California, you're effectively removing it from the water cycle. Most water uses, whether it's municipal or agricultural, it might not be the best thing to pump it full of nitrates and use it to fertilize your crops because it will have contamination problems. But at least you're not putting it underground where you're hoping it stays for as long as possible. So we've got a finite amount of water that we can use here in California, and to be taking any of it out of the water cycle just doesn't really make any sense. And that's really the primary way we dispose of fracking and oil and gas wastewater in the state. So there's been a lot of talk about fracking and earthquakes, and there's a lot that we know, but there's a lot that we don't know about this issue. So when we're talking about earthquakes from human activities, it's called induced seismicity. This is a map of the major fault lines in California. And we know that our state is crisscrossed with thousands of faults. So we need to be careful, and this is obviously an issue that's on a lot of folks' minds, and we've seen evidence in other states of fracking and its related activities causing earthquakes. And the number one and most common and direct causation of fracking activities and earthquakes is with the injection of wastewater. And we've seen examples in Ohio, Arkansas, Texas, pretty significant earthquakes up to like 5.5 caused by the injection of wastewater into underground injection wells. And the problem is when you put it at pressure, a whole bunch of water, you're going to start lubricating those faults that are under there. And if you don't do it the right way, you can cause the earth to move. That's pretty major, and we've seen property damage in communities, in Colorado and Ohio from these things, and this is a real problem. And we haven't really looked at these things here in California. We don't have a comprehensive study of what the impacts of injecting in thousands of wells around the country. And if you look at that map, some of the biggest oil-producing areas are down in that southern part of the state, the LA area and the Bakersfield area, which I don't know about you, but I see a whole lot of potential faults that I wouldn't want to set off. Yeah.
So I've been told that most of the increase in seismicity was due to the reservoir, the wastewater reservoirs creating an increased weight on the land. So like the reservoir itself would create land. And that's happened with most reservoirs. They create like Hetchy and stuff. They create Seismicity?
Induced seismicity.
There you go. There you go.
So you're talking about above ground reservoirs?
Yeah, that's what I was told was one of the main reasons for the geologic movement.
That's quite possible. I don't know much about that, but most of the oil and gas wastewater is being pumped underground. So if we're talking about it in relation to fracking, it's due to the underground pressures changing from pumping millions of gallons underground and trying to jam it into these little cracks in the rocks deep underneath there. But you may be right. I'm not expert on that.
I have no idea either.
Okay.
I've just been to things like this before, and that's what I've been told.
Got it. And stop me if you have any questions. Just throw your hands up, interrupt. We're all just having a chat here. All right, cool. So talk about community impacts of fracking. And one of the things with fracking is that it's a really new technology, and there's been this huge rush to make it happen. So there's been massive industrialization in places that haven't seen it before. Just to kind of show some of the scale, does anyone know what state is in that little box up there on this map of the United States? North Dakota. So some of you guys have seen this image before? Cool. So this one's been flying around a lot. So that looks like, compared to some of these other bright spots, a heavily urbanized area. What that light is from methane flaring in the Bakken Shale. So we're talking about a massive scale, and if you can see it from space, it's a pretty major operation, right? And you're bringing in heavy industry into rural, sometimes suburban, sometimes urban communities, and you're going to need to transport, a million gallons of water is going to require like 30,000 truckloads, or sorry, 3,000 truckloads of water to move it. And you're bringing wastewater in, wastewater out, you're having impacts on the roads, on all your infrastructure, noise, dust, light pollution, and having this stuff happen right in your backyard is pretty annoying for a lot of folks, and has a real quality of life impact. So some of the economic concerns around fracking, and when you see a massive explosion in a certain industry, there's often pressures on different parts of the economy, and the costs of maintaining all that infrastructure, those roads, the healthcare costs of people getting sick, property values have decreased in areas where fracking is going on. Would you want to buy a farm that's right next to a gas rig? I don't know. The potential for groundwater contamination, whether it's real or not, whether it's actually happened or not, is going to hurt your property values. There's been reports of people not being able to secure loans or insurance near fracking sites. Here in California, we mentioned the farmer angle, and there's the potential for fracking to expand in areas like the Central Valley and Central Coast. And those are some of the most fertile farmlands in the country. If we're to jeopardize that, we're going to have a major impact on a sector of our economy which employs around 3 million people here in California. The other thing about the economic angle is that industry likes to tout how fracking and oil and gas extraction is this huge job creator, energy independence, and some of those claims have been definitely overblown. They're trying to sell their shares of their stock and pump it up to their shareholders. A lot of the economic studies are funded by industry. There was a big one that just came out of USC saying that California could stand to gain around $25 billion. When you look at see who funded that study, it was the Western States Petroleum Association. So you want to take those numbers with a grain of salt, first of all. The other thing we know about a lot of the jobs is that the actual fracking happens over a short period of time, and so you end up with temporary jobs being created, and it's often people with specific skills who need to be brought in from different states or different places, so you're not actually creating jobs for the local economy. We know that investment in renewable energies, has way better job creation numbers. Investing in weatherizing efficiency, solar and wind creates local jobs that are much longer term and higher quality. So, if you're going to be thinking about what should we invest in to create the best jobs, fracking is not the answer. Cool. So those are kind of the big general problems and issues with fracking. Does anyone have any questions about those? Anyone's things that they've heard about that I didn't cover? Kind of wanted to keep it quick so we can get into some of the more fun stuff.
You showed a quick diagram of the accidents that have happened across the states.
Yes.
We also showed a diagram of, what it looks like kind of and geologically. What do you think are the most accidents that we see happening?
The most common is dealing with the wastewater, and it's illegal dumping of wastewater, equipment failure, transporting wastewater, spills.
So when the tube going down,
Cool.
how many spills have we had in that, or failures?
So you're talking about the well case, well problems?
Is that a common issue?
So we know that equipment fails pretty frequently. There's a recent study out of Cornell looking at Pennsylvania well numbers, which says that fracking wells have some type of integrity failing between around 6 to 9% of the time. That's one of the higher numbers. Industry will tell you it's much lower, of course, but those are from industry numbers. So we're talking with those, you can't say that if you have a problem with the cement in your well, you can't say that every time it contaminates the water. But what you can say is this is a very inherently risky process, and there's been a lot of problems in identifying contamination and causation because of lack of monitoring and testing beforehand. So if you don't have a good baseline numbers on your aquifer as far as what's in it, and then you say, oh, well, now there's methane in my water, industry can say, well, you can't prove that it's our fault. There's methane all over the place. What are you talking about? This isn't us. So there's a huge information gap, and having the proper baseline monitoring is crucial for making that happen. And I don't think there's any state where fracking is happening that has a good policy on that, and that's one of the things we're working on here in California, which I'll tell you about. Cool. Other questions on the general big picture stuff about fracking?
So can you talk about the flaming sink? And I was told that was kind of overplayed and that it was an accident. And
so yeah, that has gotten a lot of attention. So in the movie Gasland, for folks that don't know, there's this guy in Colorado who turned the sink on, lights on fire, versus flame from methane in his well. So methane getting into people's wells from fracking is a real thing. The extent of it and whether that guy, his methane was caused by fracking or not, I don't know the answer to. We know that there has been cases of methane in people's wells before fracking ever came along, but we also know that the increases of the rate of these things happening has spiked big time. And I've seen pictures of not just in people's faucets, but also methane bubbling up out of streams in Pennsylvania being lit on fire. And there's a fracking rig 100 feet away. It's not coincidence. However, sometimes it is hard to prove the causation of those things, and that's a big problem with science in general, is that it's hard to be 100% sure, and industry really likes to play on the uncertainty of those things. So that's why they're launching massive campaigns to say that these things are fake and not true and whatever. But we know that does happen. Sometimes it is caused by fracking, not always. Well, other questions? All right, we're going to zoom in a little bit. Was that a hand going up?
Yeah. Are they fracking in other countries? If we stop it here, are they just gonna frack in some other place?
They're fracking in some other places. They've banned it in some places. France has a ban on fracking, but England is looking at it, and it is expanding in other places around the world. They've got it in Australia, South Africa, and fracking has a lot of local impacts, a lot of global impacts as well, and it's certainly part of the new energy reality that we're dealing with, and it is a global issue, absolutely. All right, cool. So we're going to zoom in a little bit on California. So I mentioned earlier, California is an established oil state, and one of the big differences between the fracking here in California, both already happening and in prospective, that it's mostly for oil and not natural gas. So you can throw your whole bridge fuel thing out the window. We're talking about dirty crude oil. And we know that the Monterey Shale has the most technically recoverable oil of any oil shale play in the country. This map with it in red is one of many maps. I've seen all different versions, and this is one of the things that's hard to deal with this issue is when you're talking about things underground, it's hard to know what's real and what's not. And people come up with different maps, and there's different technology changing. So this has it stretching all the way up through the Bay Area into the North Coast. A lot of the maps only have it going down inside the southern part of the state through Monterey County, Central Valley. We know that There's a ton of oil around Bakersfield, that big blob in the middle, and then down in LA. In LA, the Inglewood oil field is the largest urban oil field in the country. So we know that fracking and oil and gas extraction, or really oil extraction, is happening in heavily, densely, populated and urban centers, which is a little different than some of the fracking fights happening on the East Coast in Pennsylvania and New York. It's more focused on the rural issues. So this Monterey Shale, 15 billion barrels of oil, companies are really excited about this, and they're trying to do everything they can to figure out how to get it. So they are cooking up new technologies. They probably are working on things that we've never heard of. We're really focused on fracking right now, but we also know of other extraction techniques like injecting hydrofluoric and hydrochloric acid into formations to help break up the rock. It's called matrix acidization. We know about acid fracking, gravel packing, steam flooding, water flooding, and these guys are, pretty serious engineers, and they're a couple steps ahead of us, and that's a little daunting. But we are finally at a place where we're starting to get a handle on what the oil industry is doing here in California, due to some public pressure and getting our government to start actually acting on it. So we may see a possible boom in the Monterey Shale, and it depends on who you ask how big this is going to be. The Bakken Shale in North Dakota, where you can see the flaring from space, there's about 4 billion barrels of oil there. We're talking 15 to 16 billion barrels of oil here, so potentially 4 times the scale of that boom going on right there. So this could be massive. However, the oil industry is going to say, oh, don't worry about it, we haven't really figured it out. But they're developing new types of technology to make this happen. So in California, our government has pretty much been asleep at the wheel on this issue. In 2011, the Environmental Working Group, one of our allied organizations, went to the Department of Conservation and the Division of Oil, Gas, and Geothermal Resources. That's a division within that department with the great acronym of DOGGR. And asked them, hey, so is there fracking going on in California? And they said, no, there's no fracking. We don't really have much natural gas. There's a little bit up in the north around Sacramento. But they said, no, we don't have much natural gas, so you shouldn't really worry about it. And then we started poking around a little more and got one of our state senators, Fran Pavley, to ask the same question. And they quickly changed their tune and said, oh, actually, fracking's been happening here for the last 50 years. So the government has basically been turning a blind eye, and they have no specific regulatory structure to deal with this practice. So there's no mention in the state code of regulations about hydraulic fracturing, what you can and can't do. It is regulated in that oil and gas drilling is regulated. You have to follow certain standards for how to drill a well. There are permits you have to get, but you don't have to say that you're going to frack a well. You don't have to say what kind of chemicals you're using. You don't have to say how much water you're using or what you're doing, where you're getting that water, what you're doing with the wastewater. And so there's this huge data gap where we don't know the impacts of the fracking that's already happened. And that makes it really hard to prepare for the fracking that we may see in the future.
If they hadn't disclosed the chemicals that they use, would the EPA ban fracking?
No. There's no law against injecting these chemicals into the ground.
Isn't there some Clean Water Act?
Yes, so the Clean Water Act is for surface water, so it protects surface water, rivers, lakes, and streams. And so basically what the Clean Water Act does is if you're going to pollute into surface water, you have to get a permit for it. So, and each body of water has a TMDL, a total maximum daily load, which is its pollution diet, and they need to make sure that they're staying under those pollution levels. So fracking wouldn't be covered under the Clean Water Act. What it would be covered under is the Safe Drinking Water Act. And if you're going to do anything that messes with a source of drinking water, like an underground aquifer, you also need to get a permit. Now, some of you, who's heard of the Halliburton loophole? Cool. So in 2005, in the National Energy Policy Act, Dick Cheney, who was our vice president at the time, famously tied to Halliburton. Halliburton happens to be the company that really developed fracking and does a lot of the fracking operations in the country, snuck into the bill an exemption for fracking from the Safe Drinking Water Act. So now what the Safe Drinking Water Act says is, okay, yeah, we got this great law, it protects all our drinking water, you got to get permits if you're going to mess with the drinking water sources. unless you're doing fracking, you don't have to do anything. So what that means is they don't have to be permitted by the EPA or the state agencies that deal with it. And so basically that's one of the reasons we have this huge lack of information, is that there's no required permitting for these well stimulation techniques. And so they get a free pass, and we have this problem where we don't really know what's going on, and potential major risks. Cool. So back to California, the state, hasn't really been doing much. We know that Governor Brown is a big friend of the oil industry, and it's too bad because he's got a good environmental record on some things, and the environmental community endorsed him when he was running for governor, and we wanted him in office. It's a hell of a lot better than the alternative. However, we know that he took a hell of a lot of money to fund his Prop 30 campaign, which is how he has balanced the budget here in California. He got that money from the oil industry, so he owes them some favors. And he's really shown that he is a friend to the oil industry, and he went as far as firing the heads of these two agencies for not processing permits quick enough in 2011. So he put in his own people at the top of the agencies, and really the goal has been to keep the oil industry moving and allow them to do their thing, and keep the pesky regulators out of the way. Let's keep this industry rolling. So, like I said, we've got a serious information gap. The industry has started to voluntarily disclose some of the things that they're doing. You can go to frackfocus.org. It's an industry-run website where you can click on fracked wells and read about them a little bit. One of the problems, though, is that it's all voluntary, so we don't know how accurate or complete the data is. You can't search it by quantity of water or types of chemicals used. It's all in PDF form. It's a pretty unwieldy site. And we're working on getting mandatory disclosure and making sure that that stuff is easier to deal with. But at this point, it's pretty lacking as far as the information you can get. And I think, as far as what's going on, we have this lack of information about what's happening, but we also have a lack of information of the potential impacts. And if we're sitting on the edge of a massive oil boom in our state, we should probably take a good hard look at what those impacts are going to be. There's been no California-specific studies on pretty much all the issues that we just ran through, all the problems. So we haven't gone, with a team of scientists and researchers. The university has not gone and looked at, all right, what will be the impact of fracking the Monterey Shale on our climate, on health in communities in those regions, on the total volume of water used and what industries are going to be impacted, which communities are going to be left out in the cold and not have enough water. Are we going to be causing earthquakes? And all these questions that we haven't answered, our state really needs to take a look at, and that would be the responsible and kind of reasonable and rational thing to do. In New York, that is the direction they're going. They are, have put a moratorium on fracking, and they're taking a look at all these issues. In California, we are involved in some efforts to make that happen. But if Governor Brown and the Department of Conservation had their way, that would not be the case. And that's why fracking is happening right now without having asked those questions. From the voluntary disclosure, we know that about 750 wells have been fracked in California. That's the answer to that pop quiz question at the beginning. And we can expect that number to grow as the technology improves.
What did you say? How many wells?
About 750. And that's voluntary disclosed. We know that a number are not listed on there, and we know that if certain types of wells, you don't have to tell anyone that they even exist. There's a whole bunch of loopholes that make it easy for oil companies to hide what the hell they're doing.
I just wanted to get some clarification for the group on the website Frack Focus.
Yes.
That's an industry-sponsored and hosted website, right?
So they will say it's not because it's run by the Groundwater Protection Council, which is kind of a state-sponsored entity, but it's advised by industry, and it's not a government-run website, so it's not subject to public records requests. It's not subject to any type of government-sponsored fact-checking or auditing. There was a report just this week from Harvard that took a big look at Frack Focus. Basically said this is a completely unacceptable way to share this information with the world, and there's a whole bunch of deficiencies with it.
And you said there's no auditing going on. So there's no way to compare what industry is saying with the reality of the situation.
There would be some ways, but not in any like workable data set. In California, you could go through well logs. There's about 60,000 oil and gas wells, and they're scanned PDFs on the Dogger website, and you can look through those and kind of glean some of the information and do a little bit of fact checking. I would need probably like all of you guys in the room to start working on that right now if we wanted to figure that out anytime soon.
Along those lines, from a social activist angle, are there any geologists or hydrologists out there that are producing good research that we can get behind to support, to raise awareness?
Yes, there's
that you're aware of.
Yeah, there's a lot of good science coming out, and it's picking up more and more steam. Since this is a relatively new issue, it takes a while to get peer-reviewed stuff out there. And most of the science has been East Coast focused, so that's a problem for us as far as like how we use that politically, because industry and legislators will say, oh, well, that's different, that's Pennsylvania. However, if you're talking about how do well casings fail or behave underground, we can expect there to be a lot of overlap. But we're working on getting more funding out here in California among nonprofits. There are some universities starting to take a harder look at it out here, and we're moving in that direction of getting more and better science. Absolutely. Cool. So Clean Water Action, along with a number of organizations, in light of this complete lack of information out there, we are calling for a moratorium on fracking in California, and we've outlined a whole bunch of questions that want to be answered. We really think that putting pressure on the governor is the number one target of our efforts. We've heard that he would veto legislation if it got to his desk that put a moratorium on it, so we've got to move his opinion through public pressure. One of those clipboards on the front, the one on top, is Clean Water Action's moratorium petition. Please start circulating that, throw your name down if you would like to stop fracking in California. If you would not, don't sign it. So our big public strategy is calling for a moratorium. That's been the most successful way to organize folks and get people involved in this issue. We're also pushing for certain regulatory things, but there's a couple of bills that are really good, and Clean Water Action, Center for Biological Diversity, and Food and Water Watch are the primary sponsors of the moratorium legislation. And actually, on Monday, these bills are being heard for the first time in Sacramento in committee, in the Assembly Natural Resources Committee. That's actually fine if you want to leave the light, you can see it better.
Cool.
So it should be exciting. We expect to move AB 1301, which is authored by Richard Bloom, out of committee. It's going to come down to 1 or 2 votes. But there's been a massive outreach effort in most of the districts of these swing voters, which are mostly down in Southern California. So if you're up here, you maybe haven't been targeted that much. But we've gotten over 120 organizations to sign on to this legislation, organized thousands of phone calls into these legislators. I talked to a few of the offices yesterday, and they were like, yeah, this is actually kind of annoying because our phones have been ringing all day about AB 1301. So there's a massive potential to build this movement, and people are engaging readily and excited about getting involved in it because it's kind of such a big issue right now, and it's getting so much press. So the organizing opportunities, and we're just scratching the tip of the iceberg, I think, as far as our movement here in California. So we're really using these moratorium bills as our vehicle for getting folks involved and excited about the issue and getting them involved. So, while our top priority is stopping fracking in California, moratorium, we understand that there's also a need to engage in this regulatory structure that's going on. And make sure that the fracking that's happening is being done as safe as possible. And we don't want to leave communities that are already getting fracked out in the cold by just being focused on ban fracking, stop fracking. So Dogger, after getting a whole bunch of public pressure and starting to just get torn apart by environmental groups and the media, has started developing a set of regulations on fracking. And they started this process last summer. They announced it. They have released a discussion draft of these regulations, which looks pretty bad. It's pretty industry friendly. It's focused mostly just on disclosure. It doesn't really limit the activities in too many ways. And some of the major holes in it are there's no monitoring of groundwater, no permitting process still for well stimulation, so you still don't have to apply for a permit to frack a well. There's no air protections, and it doesn't address some of the other stimulation techniques I mentioned, like injecting acid into the ground. So big problems with this. So we've, Clean Water and some of our allied groups have taken the lead on working to influence this set of regulations, and we've provided technical comments and been at every single public meeting and met with these regulators who are developing them and been calling them out pretty hard in the media, which is a lot of fun. And then we've also been working with the legislature to fill in some of the big holes. And there are 10 fracking bills in California being heard right now. They're all still alive, which is cool. So we're still talking about these in lots of committees. Seven of them are regulatory bills, and 3 of them are moratorium bills, and those 3 are all being heard on Monday. So the regulatory bills, if you guys want to get into the weeds, if you like reading about legislation, I put together a little website. You guys can just go there. It's on the Clean Water Action page. I'm keeping it updated pretty much day to day as far as the status of all these bills, and you can track it and ways to take action and contact your legislators. The top priority of these regulatory bills for us is AB 982. It's a groundwater monitoring bill. It's authored by Doss Williams out of Santa Barbara, who's an awesome legislator. And what it would do is require baseline monitoring before you frack a well, so testing of the groundwater, get a good read on the water quality, and then after you frack a well and for many years afterwards, continue to test that water so that if there is contamination, we know exactly when, where, and how, and who is responsible.
What was the name of that one?
AB 982. And that passed out of its first committee last week. It'll be heard in the Appropriations Committee in a couple weeks.
Without a permitting process, what point of regulation and inspection would baseline monitoring, fall under?
So one of the bills also would set up a permitting, actually 2 or 3 of the bills would set up permitting processes. So we are hoping to have a permitting process where you have to show your monitoring plan as a condition for getting your permits.
Step, right?
We do need that step. However, you could still require monitoring without a permit, because what they do right now is ask for some paperwork and notice of intent.
Okay.
It's not conditional as a permit. You don't have to do as many findings or have a public process, but you can still ask for information, and they can still tell you not to frack, even if it's not technically a permit. Cool. So I don't want to get too much in the weeds on these bills, but they're moving fast, and for folks who are into that kind of policy and politics things, follow that site, track the agendas of these committee hearings that are happening. It's pretty cool stuff. Most of them are being, you can stream them live. I believe that the hearing on Monday on these moratorium bills starts at 1:30, and there's like 30 bills being heard, so it'll go all day. Be really fun and exciting. So I hand up over there.
Yeah, so, okay, we all need water, but are there any other alternatives then?
Alternatives to
fracking?
Yeah, absolutely. I'll move it along and we'll get there in a second.
All right.
Cool. So I just want to talk a little bit about our strategies, and then I'm going to finish up with kind of some of the alternatives. So the way we approach this is, hey, we've got to have good policy. So becoming experts on this issue. And this is a pretty new issue for the environmental community. We haven't been engaged in watching what oil and gas is doing at the production level and the extraction. So there's not a huge body of expertise here in California. So we're working on kind of bringing in, folks from different states, the expertise, the policy experts, from different fields, and getting them focused on this issue. So engaging on the regulations and legislation, making sure that we're having good input over the language on all these things, and then combining that with grassroots power. So you can't get anything done. It doesn't matter how good your policy is or how good your ideas are if you don't have that public pressure to put on decision makers. So we have taken the lead on forming an alliance of groups working on this issue. And we have a network of probably 100 or so activists from different organizations, tons of information sharing going on. We've got a listserv, we had a meeting in LA where we brought together a whole bunch of people. That's where I met Ambrosia. That's why I'm here actually. So you guys were represented there.
We signed on to the Memorial to bring him to our organization and our board of directors. So we are definitely taking this in more serious capacity.
Yeah, awesome. We do canvassing on the issue, so not all the organizations involved have canvassing capacity, but Clean Water Action does. If any of you guys need a job, we're hiring canvassers all the time. We're in downtown Oakland, getting out into communities, getting folks to sign on to our positions, educating them on the issue. We've been very active in the media and with public engagement at rallies. This is from a rally of a bureau. This is at a rally of a bureau and land management auction in December. Protesting the auctioning off of 17,000 acres of public lands for fracking. So we've been very active in the public sphere, and I think that having a really strong media and outreach strategy is super important for influencing legislators and decision makers, because the more people know about this issue and the more they're talking about it, the more they're going to, hold those politicians accountable and vote the right ways. So there is a solution and there is an alternative. You asked about it, and people say, well, we need this energy. We've got to get it. We've got to pump. We've got to fill our cars up. The more and more we're learning, and the more technology is advancing, we're seeing that we really don't need to rely on fossil fuels anymore. And we could do hours of presentations on how we can transition and all that good stuff. But there was a New York Times article a couple weeks ago interviewing Mark Jacobson, who I'm sorry, here in the Cal building having to quote a Stanford guy, but he's one of the leading climate researchers on clean energy. He just came up with a plan for New York to transition to 100% clean renewable energy, and as specific as how many solar panels, where you put your wind, what kind of grid do you need. These things are all economically and technologically feasible. We do not need to rely on fossil fuels anymore. It's really a question of political will and overcoming the power of the oil and gas industry. And I just love this quote from him. It's so simple. You can power America from a technical and economic standpoint. The biggest obstacles are social and political. What you need is the will to do it. So, it's not about, what the oil and gas industry says, oh, we're not ready, solar's too expensive. We're seeing the prices drop. We're seeing countries adopt it at, rapid rates and, making the conversion. And we've got a problem with too much, oil money in our state houses and in Congress, and that's what's getting in the way right now. And, we're subsidizing the oil industry with billions of dollars every year. So, there are steps that we can take to move this along. And we've really got to start ramping up the accountability on this industry and pushing hard for renewables and clean energy. And it absolutely can be done. So that's what I would want to leave you with. I think we have about 8 minutes. Yep. So I just want to open it up, see if you guys have questions. I'm going to throw out my information if there's anything you want to learn more of directly from me. You can email me, call me anytime. It's an office line. Our website has a lot of good materials right now. I've been trying to keep it super up to date. And follow us on Facebook, of course, because that's where all the cool people are hanging out these days. So yeah, let's get some questions.
Are we doing offshore fracking, Andrew?
We've heard that there's some offshore fracking going on. It's another area that's really hard to tell what's going on. Not only is it underground, it's under the water. But yes, we think there's some offshore fracking going on.
What are the reasons why some companies like Halliburton, why do they frack?
Why do they frack? Well, if there's 15 billion barrels of oil and the way you make money is selling oil, and you know where that oil is, you're going to develop enough your technology to go out and get it. And it's as simple as there's a market for oil and gas, and that's how they make money for their shareholders.
With that said, there's so many different surveys out there on this idea of peak oil. How real is that in your studies? And for these oil companies and engineers to partake in fracking, is that a sign that peak oil is real, to take these dramatic measures with?
The more I'm involved in this, the more I reject the idea of peak oil.
Yeah.
And basically, the Earth is huge, and there's a ton of oil under there, and the deeper you drill And the more ways you find out how to get it, the more oil you're going to find. So, 5-10 years ago, the Monterey Shale was not something we were talking about. Now we're talking about 15 more billion barrels of oil. And that's just what's technically recoverable right now with some of the technologies we have. There's estimates that the Monterey Shale contains up to 500 billion barrels of oil, which, who knows what technology they're going to develop. Basically, they're going to drill deeper and they're going to use more chemicals and they're going to break the earth, to get at this stuff.
So you think it's a strategy for artificial scarcity, essentially, for profit-driven?
The peak oil idea?
Yes.
Well, it's not that we're running out of oil, it's just that it is becoming more expensive and harder to get at. So the price, for them to go in and frack the Monterey Shale, the price of oil has to stay around like $100 a barrel. Otherwise, it's not worth it, right? Because you're having to put in more equipment and price inputs. So this price has to stay up. So there is an equilibrium that it has to maintain. But as far as actually running out of oil, I don't think that is the issue right now.
Can we make like a CSSC anti-fracking chapter? Yeah, I was gonna like pass around the group and maybe we could. Oh, are you gonna do that?
Well, we're having caucus breakouts today.
Okay.
And if someone wants to lead a natural gas or a fracking caucus, we can totally do that. And yes, we can do that as a campaign. We can do that. And we'll decide like campaigns at the leadership retreat. So a good time if you want to get involved with that is to go to the leadership retreat and represent your school. Okay. And put your voice in.
So yeah, to sign up for the caucus, just find Roberta at lunch at the registration table.
You guys should definitely do that. I'm happy to help.
Yay! You'll stick around for the caucus?
I don't know about that,
No,
but more meant long term, like
Gotcha.
get your resources and materials and help with strategy and stuff. I saw one in the front.
It seems like a lot of the issues with fracking is because of the new technology and companies are taking advantage of the lack of legislation. For example, they don't have to tell what's in there, what chemicals they're using for anticoagulants when they pump it down there. So after time, once legislation catches up, do you think there is a place for fracking for natural gas? I agree that fracking for oil is a different thing, but there has to be a transition away from our dependence on carbon-based energy. And if you attack all three industries, oil, coal, and gas at the same time, it's a lot harder than if you just do oil and gas first and then get, just because if you go about the political system, because it is a game. So do you think there is a place for fracking if it's done correctly? And
well,
you think it can be done?
I don't know if it can be done correctly. No one's proven to me that it can be done correctly. So that's my first thing is, so you prove to me it can be done correctly, and then we'll talk. The second thing is, why are we focusing so much energy and attention on getting more fossil fuels out of the ground rather than putting that energy and technology into renewable things that we know are clean? That those things are out there. And the political question, I mean, that's the problem. Like a quote from Mark Jacobson, it's not about the technology, it is the reality of the politics sucks. That we have to think about bridge fuels and that we can't just turn off every coal-fired power plant tomorrow. But that is absolutely the reality. That doesn't mean that publicly I have to acknowledge that natural gas is a bridge fuel. And I don't think it is. And even if I know we have to deal with it for a little while, we can still fight it in every step of the way. You first.
Just like, how'd you get involved in this? Like as a student, like transitioning, how'd you get involved? Are you like paid to do this?
Yeah, great
question. How can we as students get involved in this later on?
So I graduated from Occidental College down in LA in 2006, and I moved back up here where I'm from, and it was during the election, so I started poking around online on Craigslist for a job. God, I got to work on one of these campaigns, and I got hired as a canvasser for Clean Water Action, knocking on doors in the 11th Congressional District and helped elect Jerry McNerney, who's a great environmental champion. We knocked out Richard Pombo, one of the worst environmental legislators in Congress. And through that job, I since then, I've been working for Clean Water Action for the last 6 years and been able to transition that into different areas. And I would say that getting your foot in the door with a job like that, even if you know, canvassing, like, I want to do more policy stuff or more high-level organizing, whatever, it is a great way to get your foot in the door and get paid to work for a cool organization and be an activist. And if you're patient and really good at it, you can kind of turn it into whatever else is out there, because you learn all the right skills. You learn the fundraising skills that it takes to sustain a job like this. You learn the communication skills, the messaging, get exposed to the issues. So that's kind of my path that I took. And yes, I'm paid full time to do this, although I'm not getting any Saturday money for hanging out with you guys, but that's okay.
So we have about 1 more minute.
Ambrosia, and then back there.
I think that maybe you can talk briefly about the economics of natural gas for domestic consumption versus export, and then also, it's two-part, and then also the building of the terminals for export around it.
Sure. It's not an area of expertise since I'm not very focused on natural gas, but what we're hearing is that a lot of the fracking that's going on in the United States is for export. There's some major proposed export terminals on our coasts to ship this stuff off to other countries. I'm going to shift that question and answer a different question to make it more California specific. A lot of the oil that we're fracking for here has very high carbon intensity. So it takes a lot of energy to get it out of the ground. It's pretty heavy, dirty crude. And we have a low carbon standard for vehicles in California. So we're not even going to be able to get to use this gas, or this oil, I should say, here in California. So we have to export it to other states and other countries. So we're stuck with a lot of the environmental damage. We don't even get the energy benefits that we're doing this for. That's a really quick answer because I want to get that last question in because you had your hand up.
Well, I have a question about some of the proposed legislation. If you're aware that if they address responsibility for remediation of wells, I mean, I know you need all the other policy pieces in place before that can happen.
As far as like the legal responsibility and the funding responsibility, so the state already has the authority to make a company clean up if it pollutes. So it's really about proving that pollution, proving the causation and the accountability on that end. And then the state has enforcement abilities where if you put toxic chemicals into someone's aquifer without going through the proper way to do it, which is a ridiculous thing to say that there could be a proper way to do that. But then they actually do have some enforcement capabilities already for that. But it's about proving it right now and connecting the dots at this point. Good question.
Cool. All right.